The squirrel did not run. That was the first thing Marco noticed. Every squirrel he had ever seen on this bridge had run. They always ran a flash of gray, a flick of tail gone before his front wheel could register their existence. But this one stood on the concrete railing with both small hands raised in the air. Still, watching him, Marco pressed the brakes. The tires whispered against packed snow. He stopped 4 feet from the animal and waited for it to bolt. It didn't. The squirrel turned its head toward the railing, then back to him, then toward the railing again. Marco had ridden this bridge every morning for 14 months. He had started the routine the week after the funeral, when the house became a place he could only tolerate in small doses. Cold air helped. Movement helped. The bridge had become the midpoint of a loop that asked nothing of him except forward motion. He had never once stopped on it before. He walked the bike to the railing and looked over the edge. The river below was white and gray and broken. The ice that had locked it solid through January had begun to crack at the edges where the current ran faster beneath the surface. There was a sound he couldn't place at first, a hollow rhythmic slapping. He looked further down the bank. He saw the yellow, a dog. Golden massive soaked, was pressing its front paws against a floating slab of ice that kept tilting away beneath the weight. Each time the animal tried to pull itself up, the ice sank at the edge and the dog slid back into the water. It had been doing this for some time. Marco could tell by the way the movements had slowed. He stood very still for 1 full second, then he moved. He would not understand until much later that the dog had not been alone at the river. 3 weeks before that morning, no one had witnessed the first meeting between the dog and the squirrel. A large golden dog had arrived at the eastern bank on a Tuesday afternoon in January and lay down in the snow beneath a bare oak tree, as if it had always belonged there. He was thin in the way that took time to notice. The thickness of the coat disguised it. But the hollows above his hips were real, and the ridge of his spine caught the low winter light when he stretched. He had no collar, he had no tags, he had apparently no person. He lay beneath the oak and put his chin on his front paws and watched the frozen river with the patient expression of an animal that had learned not to expect much. The squirrel found him on the second day. She lived in the oak. She had stored most of her winter cache in the root hollow beneath it and in a second location 30 feet east along the bank. The dog was objectively a problem. He was large and warm-smelling and occupied the root hollow entrance entirely. She circled him at a distance of 6 feet for most of the morning. He tracked her movement with his eyes. He did not stand up. He did not lunge. He did not make the sound that most dogs made when they saw her. By the second afternoon, she had reduced the circle to 3 feet. By the third morning, she had retrieved 3 acorns from the root hollow while he watched from a distance of 18 inches. By the end of the first week, she was eating on his back. She simply found that his warmth was real, and his stillness was consistent, and the space between them had stopped feeling dangerous. It happened the way most quiet things happen, gradually, without announcement, in the absence of an audience. The morning the ice broke was a Friday. The temperature had dropped to 8 below zero overnight, and then risen quickly with the sunrise, the kind of fluctuation that stresses ice at its margins, where the current runs fastest. The surface of the river looked unchanged from above. It had the same flat mat appearance it had held for 6 weeks. The dog did not know this. He had been following a bird. A small gray junco had dropped onto the ice surface about 2 meters from the bank, pecking at something caught in the frozen surface. The dog had watched it from the bank. He had stood, shifted his weight, and stepped out onto the ice. His first step was solid. His second step was solid. His third step landed closer to the edge of the slab where the current had been working at the ice from below for days. He felt the surface flex beneath him. He stopped. The bird flew. He turned to step back toward the bank. The ice gave a sound like a single-syllable, short, flat, decisive. The slab tipped. He went in front legs first, then the rest of him in one cold plunge. Water that cold pulls the warmth from a dog's muscles faster than the animal can compensate. He was a strong swimmer. He reached the floating ice slab within seconds and tried to haul himself up onto it. The edge of the slab compressed under his weight and dipped below the waterline. He slid back. He tried again from a different angle. The ice fractured at the point of contact and broke into two smaller pieces. He tried a third time. He slid back. He tried a fourth time. He slid back. On the bank above, the squirrel had watched the first attempt from the root hollow entrance. She had watched the second attempt from the lower branch of the oak. By the third attempt, she was at the edge of the bank 2 feet above the waterline, chattering, pacing, circling without purpose. The dog's movements were already slower. She ran, not toward the water where there was nothing she could do. Up the embankment, along the frozen dirt path, up the stone steps to the pedestrian bridge above. She ran the length of the bridge railing and stopped at the midpoint. Below her 60 feet of ice-edged river. The dog was still there, still pressing against the ice, slower now. She looked up. The path was empty in both directions. She made the sound she made when she saw a hawk. She made it again. She made it again. Nothing changed. She ran to the far end of the bridge and back again. She ran back to the midpoint. In the distance from the east end of the bridge, she saw a figure on a bicycle. She jumped from the railing to the walking path. She stood in the center of the path. She raised both forepaws in the air, the instinctive upright posture of a squirrel scanning for threat. The bicycle got closer. She did not move. The bicycle slowed, stopped. The man on the bicycle looked at her the way people always looked at her, with a brief, entertained surprise. She turned her head toward the railing. She looked back at him. She turned her head toward the railing again. She did not know if he understood. She only knew that he walked to the railing, and when he looked over, he stopped moving entirely. Marco registered the scene in pieces. The broken ice, the open channel of dark water, the yellow shape pressed against the edge of a slab, the slow, depleted rhythm of the struggling. He did not spend time on shock. He unclipped the cargo strap from the rear rack of his bike, the orange elastic one with metal hooks at each end, approximately 4 feet long. He pulled the drawstring from the hood of his outer jacket. He tied them end to end with a square knot, testing it twice with a sharp tug. The combined length was just under 8 feet. He looked at the gap between the bridge rail and the water. It was not enough. He looked at the embankment steps 20 feet to his left. He ran to them. The steps were iced over. He went down them sideways, one hand on the railing, moving faster than was sensible. He reached the bank level, moved along it to the point closest to the dog, and crouched at the edge. The water was 40 inches below the bank lip. He lay down on his stomach, the cold of the frozen ground pressing through his jacket instantly. He extended his arm over the edge with the looped end of the line. The dog was 6 feet out on the ice slab head, barely above the waterline. The animal's eyes found him. They were brown and exhausted, and they held the particular expression of a creature that has stopped expecting rescue and has not yet finished deciding whether to stop altogether. Marco held the loop at the surface of the water and made a sound. Not a word. Just a sound, low, steady, the same register 3 times. The dog looked at the loop. It did not move toward it. Marco moved the loop in a small, slow circle. The dog watched it. He made the sound again. The dog pushed off the ice, with its back legs, a weak, slow movement, and drifted toward the bank. Marco dropped the loop over the dog's head with a single motion and pulled it snug behind the ears. He did not jerk the line. He pulled with steady, even pressure, leaning back, redistributing his weight away from the edge. The dog's front paws found the bank wall and scrabbled. Marco pulled. The dog came up the face of the bank in 3 uneven surges. Paws finding purchase in the frozen dirt, the weight enormous and wrong-angled and almost more than Marco could manage from flat on his stomach. The dog cleared the lip and collapsed on the frozen ground. Marco sat up. He stayed on his knees beside the animal. The dog was shaking in the full body way of severe cold, not a shiver but a seizing, involuntary tremor that ran from the shoulders to the hindquarters in continuous waves. Marco unzipped his down jacket and took it off. He was wearing a thin wool base layer. The cold hit him like a wall. He spread the jacket over the dog's back and pressed it down along the sides, tucking the edges beneath the animal the way you tuck a blanket under a mattress, slow, deliberate, making sure the coverage was complete. The dog did not move during this. It lay still and shook and breathed in shallow, rapid increments. Marco put one hand flat on the dog's rib cage. He could feel the heart. Fast, but there. He looked up. The squirrel was sitting on the bank 3 feet away. It was watching the dog. It was not watching Marco. It had the focused, absorbed attention of an animal that has been waiting for a specific outcome and is now watching to see if it has arrived. Marco looked at it for a moment. He looked back at the dog. He understood with a certainty that had no logical basis that these two animals knew each other. He did not know what to do with that information yet. First things first. He needed to get the dog somewhere warm. He needed to do it in the next 20 minutes. Marco stood up and took inventory. The dog could not walk the hind legs when it tried to stand folded immediately. The bike had a rear rack and a small handlebar bag. Neither was useful here. The nearest veterinary clinic was 2.1 miles east. His house was 2 miles north. The temperature was 8 below zero and dropping as the morning wind picked up off the river. He took out his phone. His fingers, bare now since he had pulled off his gloves to tie the knot, did not respond well to the touchscreen. He breathed on them, rubbed them together, tried again. He opened a rideshare app. The screen told him the nearest driver was 9 minutes away. He typed in his home address. He hesitated. He changed it to the address of the veterinary clinic. He hesitated again. The clinic opened at 9. It was 8:14. He changed the address back to his home. He confirmed the ride. 9 minutes. He crouched back down beside the dog and put both palms flat against the animal's side, pressing the jacket closer. His own body temperature was dropping. He registered this as information rather than complaint, something to account for, not to dwell on. He was aware of the squirrel moving to his left. He turned his head. She had climbed onto the dog's back above the jacket line and was sitting there with her tail curved up over her body like a comma. She was not moving. She appeared to be sitting with him. Marco looked at this arrangement for a moment. He turned back to watching the road above the embankment for the car. The driver arrived in 7 minutes. His car was a gray sedan with a pine tree air freshener visible in the window. He pulled up and lowered the passenger window. He took in the scene on the embankment below the man, in a thin wool shirt kneeling in the snow. The large soaking wet dog wrapped in a down jacket. The squirrel positioned on top of the entire arrangement with an expression that moved through several stages before settling on something resigned. He got out. He opened the rear door. Marco said he would pay for any damage to the seats. The driver said to get in. Marco lifted the dog. The animal was dense with wet weight, 65 pounds, all of it limp and unresisting. Marco got the dog into the rear seat and climbed in beside it, settling the animal's head across his lap. He reached back toward his jacket to pull it more securely around the dog's hindquarters. Something moved in the chest pocket. He had forgotten about the squirrel. He did not remember putting her there. He did not remember the moment on the embankment when apparently she had climbed from the dog's back to his arm, to his jacket pocket, while he was focused on other things. The driver in the front seat watched this in the rearview mirror. He said nothing. He turned the heat to maximum. He pulled into the road. The interior of the car warmed in increments. Marco felt it return to his hands first, the slow, uncomfortable thawing of circulation coming back. The dog's trembling did not stop, but it changed in quality, less violent, more even. The animal's eyes, which had been half closed since the embankment, opened more fully. It looked up at Marco without lifting its head. Marco met the look. He did not say anything. He kept his hand on the dog's side and felt the breathing gradually deepen. The squirrel emerged from the jacket pocket with the cautious periscope motion of a small animal testing a new environment. She looked at the car ceiling. She looked at the driver's headrest. She looked at the dog. The dog turned its head 3 inches in her direction. They remained like that. the squirrel on the edge of the jacket pocket, the dog's head in Marco's lap, both of them looking at each other for the remaining 6 minutes of the drive. The driver pulled into Marco's driveway and put the car in park. He watched the two animals in the rearview mirror with the expression of someone deciding whether to ask. He asked whether they knew each other. Marco said he thought so. The driver nodded. He got out and held the rear door while Marco extracted himself and the dog. Marco managed it in 2 motions. First, the dog's hindquarters, then his own exit, keeping the animal's weight distributed across his forearms. He stood in the driveway with the dog held against his chest. The squirrel had transferred herself to his shoulder at some point during the exit. The driver looked at all of this. He asked if Marco was going to be all right. Marco said yes. The driver got back in his car. Marco stood in the driveway for a moment after the car left. The morning was quiet. The snow on the roof of the house had not changed. The shutters on the upstairs bedroom window were still closed, as they had been closed since October of the previous year. Marco looked at the house. Then he carried the dog inside. The warmth of the interior was immediate and absolute. Marco had left the heat at 68 degrees, the setting he had established sometime in November, and never changed. He took the dog to the living room. He had kept an old wool blanket on the bottom shelf of the bookcase for the past 14 months. It had been his wife's, a heavy brown and cream one she had bought at a craft market years ago and used for reading on the sofa. He had not been able to put it away. He had also never used it. He pulled it from the shelf now and spread it on the floor in front of the radiator, smoothing it flat with both hands, working the corners out to the full rectangle the way she used to do before she settled into it. He laid the dog on the blanket. He went to the bathroom and retrieved 2 towels. He came back and began drying the animal, starting at the head, working back, pressing the towel in and lifting, rather than rubbing the way you do it when the goal is warmth rather than speed. The dog submitted to this entirely. It lay without protest and watched Marco's face while Marco worked. Its tail moved once a single slow sweep across the wool blanket and then lay still again. Marco dried the back legs, which were cold in a different way than the rest of the animal cold, at a depth that the towel couldn't reach. He went to the kitchen and retrieved his hairdryer from under the sink. He returned to the blanket. He set the dryer to the lowest setting and moved it slowly along the dog's flank, 6 inches from the skin, his other hand following behind to monitor the temperature. The coat began to lift and separate under the warm air. The dog's eyes closed. Its breathing, which had been shallow and rapid, began to slow. Marco worked the dryer over the hindquarters, then back up along the spine, then down the legs. He spent extra time on the back legs. He did not hurry. The squirrel, for her part, had jumped from his shoulder to the back of the sofa sometime during the toweling and was watching the proceedings from that elevation, with the focused lateral attention of a small animal monitoring something it cannot classify. When Marco finally turned the dryer off, the dog's coat was dry and full, and considerably lighter in color than it had appeared at the river, a true gold, the warm shade of late afternoon light. Marco sat back on his heels. He looked at the animal on his wife's blanket in front of his radiator. Now that the coat was dry and lifted, he could see what the river had obscured, the slight concavity along the ribs, the gentle inward curve of an animal that had been missing meals for some time. No collar. He placed 2 fingers lightly in the hollow above the dog's hip. Real. He had been hoping on some level that a collar had simply been obscured by the wet fur, that there would be a tag, a phone number, a person. There was none of these things. He set a shallow bowl of water on the blanket beside the dog's head. The dog opened its eyes, looked at the bowl, and drank from it in slow, steady pulls until it was half empty. Then it put its chin back on the blanket and looked at Marco. Marco looked back. He was sitting cross-legged on the floor of his own living room in a wool base layer with a large gold dog on his dead wife's blanket and a squirrel on the back of his sofa. He stayed there. He had nowhere to be. The first thing Marco did the next morning was post a photograph online. He had taken it the night before, the dog asleep, on the blanket, the coat dry, and even the expression neutral in the way of a sleeping animal. He posted it to 3 places: the neighborhood group, the county lost pet registry, and the general platform where local notices sometimes traveled. He described what he had found: male golden retriever approximately 3 years old. No collar found near the river bridge on Friday morning. Then, he made coffee. He stood at the kitchen counter while it brewed and watched the dog who had moved during the night from the blanket to the kitchen doorway. Not inside the kitchen, not in the living room, but occupying the threshold precisely. Marco set a food bowl down with some rice and plain boiled chicken. The dog ate it carefully without rushing in the manner of an animal that has learned to take food seriously. Marco drank his coffee. The squirrel came down from wherever she had slept. It turned out to be the gap between the bookcase and the wall, and helped herself to the small pile of walnut halves Marco had left on the kitchen windowsill. The morning had a quality he couldn't name immediately. Then he placed it. It was occupied. The house was doing something containing activity, registering the presence of living things, and this was different from the silence that had lived in every room since October of the year before. He refreshed the lost pet posts throughout the morning. By noon, he had 14 comments. Most were expressions of sympathy or offers to share the post. 2 were inquiries that turned out after a brief exchange to involve different dogs. No one claimed the animal in the photograph. By 3 in the afternoon, he had made an appointment at the veterinary clinic for the following Monday. The vet scanned the dog for a microchip with the practiced 2-second sweep of someone who does this 40 times a day. The scanner did not respond. She checked his teeth, his eyes, his joints, his coat. She said he was about 3 years old in reasonable health, considering malnourished, but not severely. His muscle mass suggested he had been moving regularly, probably living outside for a while. Then she paused. She pointed out the way the dog was sitting. Marco looked. The dog was sitting squarely on the exam table with its feet together and its weight evenly distributed, not leaning or shifting. Someone had taught him that. She said whoever had him had known what they were doing. Marco said nothing. There was nothing to say. She gave him the paperwork for a 30-day lost pet waiting period before official adoption could be processed, and a list of vaccines the dog would need. Marco folded the paperwork into his jacket pocket. In the car on the way home, the dog rode in the back seat and watched the passing streets through the window. Marco watched him in the rearview mirror. He thought about someone taking the time to teach an animal to sit properly, patiently, repeatedly, until the behavior became automatic, and then arriving somehow at a point where the animal had to be left behind. He had learned in the past 14 months that people arrived at impossible positions by routes that were rarely simple. Sometimes you lost the thing you had been most careful with. The first week arranged itself around the dog's needs. Meals at 7 and 5. A walk at 8 in the morning along the river path, a shorter walk at dusk. Marco had not walked anywhere with purpose in the morning for 14 months. He had cycled, which was different, faster, less attended more about covering ground than occupying it. Walking with the dog was slower. The dog stopped frequently, not from hesitation, but from interest, pressing his nose to a particular patch of snow, tracking something invisible along the base of a fence line. Marco stopped when the dog stopped. He stood in the cold and looked at whatever the dog was looking at. He saw nothing usually, but the standing was not unpleasant. He had forgotten, it seemed, how to stand still outside. On the 4th morning, Marco said a single word at the corner before crossing the road. The dog sat. On the 5th morning, he said a second word and stepped 3 feet forward. The dog did not move. Marco stepped back. He simply stood beside the dog for a moment before they crossed together. On the 8th morning, he crouched down at the end of the walk and put his hands on either side of the dog's face. The dog held very still. Marco did not say anything. He just held the dog's face in his hands for a moment, and then they went inside. He did not record this moment. It was between him and the dog, and the cold, clear morning. The squirrel's integration into the house was a different kind of process. She was not interested in being held. She was not interested in being approached directly. She was, however, intensely interested in everything in the house. Marco began to find evidence of this survey in the mornings. A pencil moved from the desk to the floor. A magazine nudged to the edge of the coffee table, a rubber band redistributed to the center of the kitchen rug for reasons that remained unclear. He stopped trying to understand her logic. He started leaving things for her walnut halves and sunflower seeds on the kitchen windowsill, each morning a small ceramic dish of water on the bookcase shelf. On the 6th day, she sat on the kitchen table while he ate breakfast. Not at the table. On the far corner with a walnut she had carried from the windowsill, occupying the same space in the same silence for 20 minutes. Marco did not move toward her. He ate his eggs and read the section of the newspaper he always read first and left the rest of the walnut halves where they were. On the 10th day, she climbed onto his shoulder while he was standing at the counter with his morning coffee. He did not move. He stood very still and looked out the window and felt her weight surprisingly solid for something so small shift as she adjusted her footing. She sat there for perhaps 40 seconds. Then she jumped to the counter and ran back to the windowsill. Marco picked up his coffee cup. His hand was entirely steady. He noticed, smiling. He could not remember the last time his face had done that, without being asked to. The reconciliation between the dog and the squirrel inside the house happened at its own speed, which was not Marco's speed. In the first days indoors, the dog tracked her movement with his eyes whenever she crossed the room. His tail moved. He did not lunge. He did not bark. The squirrel moved around him with the slightly wider arc of an animal adjusting to different terrain. On the 5th day in the house, the dog was lying on the blanket in the afternoon, and the squirrel descended from the bookcase and approached. She stopped 2 feet away. She sat up. She looked at him. He looked at her. Neither of them moved for a considerable time. Then the squirrel moved forward until she was 12 inches from the dog's front paw. She sat down again. The dog exhaled through his nose a long, deliberate breath and lowered his chin to his paws. She sat beside him for 11 minutes. Marco timed it from the armchair from behind the book he was not reading. 11 minutes. Then she left. On the 7th day, she ate a walnut on the dog's back. Not in the tentative exploratory way of the early embankment days, but with the easy familiarity of an animal returning to a known location. She climbed up, settled, and ate the walnut in segments with the focused rotating motion of a squirrel at work. The dog slept through the entire thing. On the 9th day, Marco came downstairs to find them both in the patch of early sun that came through the east-facing kitchen window each morning at precisely 7:40 low, long, almost horizontal, falling across the floor in a parallelogram of yellow. The dog was in the center of it, on his side, one front leg extended. The squirrel was curled against the dog's belly inside the warmth that radiated from the larger animal. Her eyes were closed. Marco stopped in the kitchen doorway. He stood there for a long moment. Then he went and made coffee quietly without disturbing them. He stood at the counter and drank it while he watched them sleep. He thought about the river. He thought about the squirrel on the railing, with her hands raised, standing in the center of the path, doing the only thing available to her. A small animal that had been frightened. In her fright, she had done something that happened to matter. He had been riding that bridge for 14 months without stopping. He had needed a reason to stop. That was real regardless of what you called it. He set his coffee cup down. He looked at the 2 sleeping animals in the morning light. He thought, I did not come to the river looking for anything. He thought, that may have been the problem. On the 28th day, Marco went to the veterinary clinic alone and signed the adoption paperwork. He had a name by then. He had been calling the dog by it for 2 weeks before he understood that he had made a decision. The name was Birch. He signed the paperwork. He folded his copy and put it in his jacket pocket. He drove home. Birch was at the door when he came in. The squirrel was on the kitchen windowsill. Marco hung up his jacket. He stood in the hallway of his house and felt the quality of it, the particular weight and texture of a space where things were living, where there were 2 other heartbeats occupying the rooms. He went to the kitchen. He put the kettle on. He let Birch out into the backyard. He put fresh walnuts on the windowsill. He stood at the window and watched Birch move through the snow in the yard. the unhurried exploratory circuit of an animal that has learned that this specific square of frozen ground is its ground. The squirrel finished her walnut and climbed onto his shoulder. He stood there with her weight on his shoulder and his hands around the warm mug and watched the dog in the yard. He had not opened the curtains on the upstairs bedroom window since October. He thought he might tomorrow. Not yet. But tomorrow was a thing that existed now, in a different way than it had existed before. Tomorrow had birch to walk. Tomorrow had walnuts to put out. Tomorrow had the morning sun coming through the east kitchen window at 7:40, falling across the floor in a shape his wife would have liked. She had always liked the way winter light came in low. He had forgotten that until recently. He remembered it now. 3 months later, on a morning in late April, Marco unlocked his bicycle from the porch hook for the first time since January. The snow had been gone for 3 weeks. The river was running fast and clear. He walked the bike to the end of the driveway. Birch was beside him, the new red leash clipped to his collar. A collar with a small rectangular tag that had his name on one side and Marco's number on the other. Birch sat at the end of the driveway and waited. Marco clipped on his helmet. He looked down at the dog. He left the bike on the porch. They walked together down the road toward the river path, the dog's pace setting the tempo, which was unhurried and interested and comfortable with stopping. They stopped twice before the bridge. Once for a scent trail along a fence post that Birch apparently found significant. Once because a pair of crows had landed on the road ahead and Birch wanted to watch them for a while. Marco waited both times without impatience. They reached the bridge. Marco walked out to the midpoint. He put his hands on the concrete railing, still cold, even in April, and looked down at the river. The water was high with snowmelt moving fast, greenish-gray and opaque. No ice, no broken surface, no yellow shape struggling at the margins. Just water doing what water does. Birch sat beside his left foot and looked out at the same view, his ears forward, his nose reading the river smell. They stood there for a while, the man and the dog on the bridge in the April morning. Marco was going to call his daughter that evening. She lived in Portland. She had called him 15 times since October of the previous year. He had answered 4 of them. She deserved better than 4. He was going to tell her about Birch. He was going to tell her about the squirrel, whose name he had eventually settled on Hazel for the color of her coat in the afternoon light. He was going to tell her that the house had changed. Not back to what it was. It would never be that. But changed towards something that had warmth in it and routine, and 2 other heartbeats in the rooms, and the morning sun coming in at 7:40 across the kitchen floor. He was going to tell her, come visit. Birch stood up. He turned away from the railing and looked up at Marco, the signal of a dog that has decided the current location has been sufficiently examined and would like to continue to the next one. Marco turned away from the river. They walked off the bridge together into the April morning, back toward the house where Hazel was waiting on the kitchen windowsill, with the focused patience of a small animal that has somewhere to be and knows exactly where that is. The sun was up. The path was clear. Marco walked his dog home.